This is me, and I'm about to do an overhead smash in a pickleball rig game. What you're about to witness may be disturbing, and something that you might also be doing in your own pickleball games. And if that's the case, stay tuned and finish watching the whole video, because I'm going to share with you what I've been doing to change my overhead smash from this to this. I think overhead smash is quite an overlooked technique in pickleball. While this shot may come naturally to people who's had many years of tennis or badminton experience, but for people who didn't have that kind of background, this shot can be very challenging to execute, especially being able to execute it consistently. As lobbing is becoming a more popular strategy in modern day pickleball, I think having a reliable overhead smash to defend yourself against those irritating lobs would be extremely useful. But before we dive in, a little background about myself. I'm 38 years old, and I started playing pickleball about 6 months ago. Before playing pickleball, I had zero competitive sports background and no formal training in any sports. As it stands today, I'm a hard 3.5 duper rated player with limited competitive pickleball experience. My long-term goal is to be able to play and enjoy this sport at a high level, and maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to enjoy pickleball full-time one day. But before I get too far ahead of myself, for my next immediate goal, I just want to get good enough to be able to compete with the 4.0 duper players. Now, back to overhead smash again. I think in order for me to understand why my overhead is so bad right now, I need to first study and analyze how the best people do this shot, then compare that to what I'm doing today. I'm gonna start by looking at none other than the tennis legend Pete Sampras himself, perhaps regarded as one of the best to have ever mastered this shot. I'm gonna analyze and break down what I see, and then just do my best to copy him. So the first thing I notice right away is that as soon as he sees the lob coming, he starts turning his body sideways, with the chest facing side of the court. And because his chest is now facing side of the court, this allows him to move around the court sideways using shuffle steps, kind of like how a crab would move sideways. Then he keeps moving his body until he's about to approach the final spot where the ball is going to be landing on top of him. Then you see him taking one last adjustment step to perfectly situate his body in order to prepare for the shot. One thing to note here is that on his last step, you can see that he compresses his back leg and transferring most of his weight onto this leg. I think this helps him to stop his backward momentum quickly. Then he raises the left hand in the air, pointing in the direction where the ball is coming from. He then begins loading his right hand with the racket to be behind his head, similar to before you're about to throw a baseball. And right before he takes the shot, he takes a small jump to reach to the ideal height in the air, then swing his right arm upwards from behind his head to make contact with the ball directly above him. So that's definitely a lot of details to unpack here, and I'm going to go through all the details that I'm able to observe one by one here. So I'm going to rewind the video back to the moment before he makes a small jump. What I see here is that he actually brings his left foot in a little bit closer to his body, and I think this allows him to be standing with both of his feet shoulder wide, giving him a good balance. The other little detail that I see is when he swings with the racket, I see that he's first rotating both of his shoulders, then immediately the right elbow comes up naturally as he rotates his shoulders, then lastly his forearm. And when his racket finally makes contact with the ball, his right arm is straight and is pointing straight up. And the angle of the racket is pointing a little bit downward in order to keep the ball down. The point of contact is ever so slightly in front of his right shoulder. Now I do want to mention one thing here, and I think it's very important. A tennis ball stays on a tennis racket for longer than a pickleball stays on a pickleball paddle when you hit a ball. And for this reason, I think when you make contact with the pickleball, the angle of your paddle should be adjusted to be pointing a little bit more downward than tennis racket. However, I understand that it could be wrong here. If that's the case, please correct me. Whether you agree with this or not, post your opinions down below in the comments so others can learn from you as well. The other interesting thing I see is that throughout the entire swing, his movement looks very fluid to me. His arm and his wrist look very relaxed. he doesn't appear to be muscling his arm and wrist with a lot of force. Let's take a look at another tennis legend, Novak Djokovic, and watch how he does the overhead smash. Again, very similar here. He first turns his body so his chest is facing the side of the court. He then proceeds onto using the small shuffle steps to maneuver his body around the court. Once he's in the final spot, he raises his left hand to help guide the ball. Then he loads his right hand behind his head and makes a very smooth rotation with his right arm and racket upwards to head the ball. Throughout the entire swing, his arm and wrist appear to be relaxed, and that's the key. Again, the point of contact here is just slightly in front of his right shoulder. Okay, here's the fun part. I'm now going to look at myself and see what I'm doing wrong in comparison. Now right away, the first thing I see with my technique is that I'm not turning my body sideways. And because I'm not turning my body sideways first, when I move my body around, I'm actually just backpedaling rather than using the sideways shuffle steps. Now at this point, because my footwork is already completely off, it makes it very difficult for me to perform the subsequent movements. So all the backpedaling I was doing is actually slower than using shuffle steps. It does mean that I didn't have quite enough time to get to the ideal spot to head the ball. And instead, what I did here was that I took a big jump backwards as a last ditch effort to quickly get to the ideal location for heading the ball. And of course, as you see later on, trying to head that ball while in the air leaning backwards is just not a good idea. Now the other thing I see here is that because I was already scrambling by this point, I really didn't have enough time to raise my left hand properly for guiding the ball. I didn't have time to properly load my right arm with the paddle to be behind my head. At this point, my technique was just completely off. I was just rushing through every stage of this shot execution and just hoping for the best. Very unfortunately for the other team, I got lucky that the ball barely caught the top edge of the paddle on its way down. So the ball landed inside the court with no pace behind it, and the other team was able to return the ball back to me with no problem. So after understanding what my problems are, I went out to the court with my wife. She then fed me 300 balls to help me practice my overhead. And throughout the entire drill session, I focused on these key things, one or two things at a time. Firstly, turn the body sideways. Then move my body using shuffle steps rather than backpedaling. Raise my left hand to track the ball before it gets to my strike zone. Load my paddle behind my head. Relax my arm and wrist throughout the swing. Fully extend my right arm when heading the higher balls. Making contact with the ball just in front of my right shoulder. But before I started actually hitting the ball, I asked my wife to toss me a few balls, allowing me to catch it using my left hand. And the goal here is for me to first practice getting used to the body turning motion and also how to move my body around the court using shuffle steps and how to also guide the ball using my left hand. Now after warming up my body with this exercise, I then began round 1 of my practice. So during this round 1, I was very much focused on just making sure that I was turning my body sideways, making sure that I was using shuffle steps, and also raising my left hand to guide the ball. And looking at the recording here, I think I was doing a decent job at these things that I was trying to focus on. I definitely felt like I was getting a lot more nimble at moving around the court since I was using shuffle steps rather than backpedaling, and also I was able to more accurately position my body to prepare for the head. As you can see here, I was still very inconsistent with my heads and making lots of errors. Luckily, thanks to a pickleball friend of mine, Jeff, who happened to be sitting there watching me practice the whole time. He pointed out to me that my arm and my wrist looked too tense, and I was hitting the ball perhaps with too much force. So he suggested to me that maybe I should try and focus on relaxing my arm and my wrist for the next round of practice. So I did. And for the entire second round of practice, my focus was just to relax my arm and wrist. Instead of using a lot of force with my arm to try and muscle the ball down, I would instead focus on making sure that I load my paddle properly behind my head, so all the pace that I can generate when I hit the ball will be coming from the whipping motion of me throwing out my arm, just like how you throw a baseball. And you may need to rewind back to round 1 and compare the differences, but I must say, when I was hitting the ball with my arm and wrist relaxed, the shots felt a lot smoother and snappier. Not only it felt less strenuous on my arm, but I felt like I was actually hitting the ball with even more pace than before. The other interesting thing I noticed was that because I wasn't trying to muscle down a ball anymore with my arm, I was able to control my movement better and making more consistent shots than before. So the tip that Jeff gave me definitely helped me a lot. Big shout out to Jeff. So at the end of the second round, I asked Jeff again what's the next thing I should be focusing on to try and make my shots even better. He suggested to me that maybe try focusing on letting my right arm naturally follow through a bit more after the paddle makes contact with the ball. It helps to make the shot smoother. Once again, for round 3, I really tried to just focus on letting my right arm follow through after I hit the ball. I even purposely exaggerated my movement just to develop a feel for the arm following through. If you rewind back to any of the previous rounds and pay close attention to the movement of my right arm after I hit the ball, you should be able to see the differences. And in this third round, I'm no longer letting my arm come to a sharp stop soon after I hit the ball. Once again, shout out to Jeff for this feedback. So at the end of the third round, I went back to Jeff and asked him again in terms of what I could do to improve my shot further. He mentioned to me that maybe my right arm and shoulder are not fully extended when I'm hitting those higher balls. He then went on to suggest that maybe I could try practicing just stretching out my right shoulder all the way and fully extend my arm into the air when hitting the ball. This will help me get a higher reach. Once again, that's exactly what I focused on in this fourth round. This change might be harder to detect, but if you look carefully at this slow motion, you see that I was really doing everything I can to stretch out my right shoulder and fully extend my right arm. And after hitting the same shot for over 300 times, my body was starting to give up at this point. We decided to then move on to some other drills just to switch things up a little bit. And if you're interested in seeing the other drills that we did, you can subscribe to this channel, so when new videos are released in the future, you'll be the first to see them. The next day, my wife and I went out to the court again because I wanted to test myself to see if I can still remember all the things that I practiced from day 1 and string it all together. Now, you may not agree with this, but I definitely think looking at these shots that I'm making on day 2, they just look better than any of the shots that I did on the previous day. My movements looked more fluid on day 2, and it felt more natural too, and my shots were more consistent. Now, if we look at a slow motion here, I definitely see myself still turning the body sideways, shuffling my feet, raising my left hand, loading my right arm behind my head, keeping my arm and wrist fairly relaxed. Then I swing my arm to hit the ball. I stretch out my shoulder and extend my arm out, so when I make contact with the ball, it's at the highest point that my paddle can reach. Then lastly, I made sure that I let my arm follow through after I hit the ball. Here's another shot where I had to move a few steps to reposition my body. Same thing here. I can see myself executing the key things that I've been trying to focus on. Honestly, I was pretty happy with the result, just to see my own improvement on this shot. I'm aware that I'm still a long way away from being able to perfect this shot, but for the time being, I just need my overhead to be effective, because there are still many other things that I need to go get better at. Moving forward, I'll be uploading more videos to show you what I do to improve myself as a pickleball player. If you found this video entertaining or helpful in any way, or you would like to support my journey to become a better pickleball player, you can simply hit the subscribe and like buttons down below. I would really appreciate your feedback and support. Now, to summarize my learnings from this, again, I'm just a hard 3-5, and I wouldn't be offended at all if you don't agree with anything I've shared in this video. I'm just sharing my own personal experience. If it helps you, then I would feel very fulfilled that I can help. If it doesn't help, just ignore it. Either way, please feel free to post your comments down below so others can learn from you. The first and most important thing I learned from this is that all shots are complex, especially if you want to execute it well and execute it consistently. So to learn how to execute any shot well, you've got to deconstruct and break down a shot into a sequence of many smaller steps, then only focusing on practicing 1 or 2 steps at a time. And for me personally, the key steps that help me to improve my overhead smash involves turning body sideways, using shuffle steps to move around, raise the non-dominant hand to guide the ball, load the dominant hand and paddle behind my head, adjust the feet to be shoulder wide, relax arm and wrist, throw the dominant hand and the paddle upward like throwing a baseball, stretch out the dominant shoulder and arm as paddle makes contact with the ball. Make contact with the ball just slightly in front of the dominant shoulder with paddle facing slightly downward. Lastly, let a dominant hand and paddle follow through after hitting the ball. And here it is, how to improve pickleball overhead smash as a 3-5. I hope we can meet again in the next video.